The wind came through Bittergrass Valley like it had something to prove, tearing across sage and scrub until it found the little house that used to belong to Ruth Claymore. Now it belonged to her son, Elias, and the 3 young ones he kept alive with fieldwork and grief. There was a 4th child once, but she had not lived through the fever. In the evenings, when the sun cracked low over the butte, the porch would groan under Elias' boots, and the children would draw shapes in dust with twigs, speaking low like orphans who didn't yet believe in permanence. It was Hannah, the eldest at 9, who first said it. "We need a woman with hands, not dresses." She didn't mean a wife for Elias. She meant something steadier than winter, steadier than the hunger that sometimes stretched their suppers thin. Elias, still in the ache of burying too many hopes, said nothing. But she went on. She'd seen an ad in a paper Mr. Wren at the Mercantile let her look through when she helped sweep mail-order brides, some from Boston, some from St. Louis. Women with photographs and soft mouths promising skill in piano or embroidery. But Hannah was not swayed by polish. She waited for a woman with no photograph, no claim to beauty or coin. Just a short line in crooked script, tucked near the bottom of the page. No dowry, steady hands, willing to work. She tore the page out, kept it in the pocket of her dress for 3 days before she showed it to Elias. He took it slow from her hand, frowned at the ink like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. "You write her," Hannah said, and when he didn't answer, she added, "We already did." The letter had gone out, with the last post run east. And in the brittle days that followed, the children cleaned the house as best they could. Reuben mended the broken rocker with twine, and little Molly picked wildflowers with shaking hands, arranging them in a rusted tin on the windowsill. Elias did not stop them. She arrived in early April, when the earth was still stubborn in its thaw and the creek just beginning to stammer with melt. Her name was Cora Linden. She stepped down from the coach with a satchel made of canvas and her skirts cut short for riding. No parasol, no bonnet, only a faded blue kerchief tied behind her head and the wary, quiet look of someone accustomed to disappointment. The coachman handed down her satchel and she nodded thanks without speaking. Her eyes, dark as the wing of a swallow, swept the children first, then Elias. "Ma'am," he said, awkward as a colt learning bit in rain. "I didn't send the letter." "I know," she answered. Her voice was plain. "They did." Cora followed them home on foot, refusing Elias' offer of his mule. She said walking helped her keep her thoughts in order. Behind them, the coach rattled back to town, and silence followed like a shadow. That night, she took to the little room that used to be Ruth's sewing space. No one asked her to. She simply looked at the house, at the shelves and the faces, and the way the chimney smoked crooked to the left, and knew where to place herself. In the corner of absence, without demand, the children watched her closely. Not the way they had watched the preacher's wife, or the neighbor girl who came with jam in small jars. Those women left quickly, their kindness worn thin by grief they hadn't grown inside. Cora moved through the house like someone who had lost things too, but learned not to flinch when the floor creaked under her. She woke before them, boiled coffee thick enough to chew, and sliced potatoes into hash without waiting to be told where the knife was kept. Her hands never shook. She sewed Hannah's hem without a word, sanded the splinters off Reuben's palm, and once, when Molly had a night cry, sat beside her in stillness till the child breathed deep again. Elias kept himself in the fields, turning the soil under and pretending it was just the season changing. But every now and then he'd glance toward the house, watching smoke rise in steady plumes, and feel something inch loose in his chest. On the 5th morning, Hannah followed Cora to the creek with a bucket. They crouched beside the water, both quiet, both watching a hawk pass overhead. "You didn't ask about Papa," Hannah said. Cora rinsed the bucket slowly. "Didn't seem like you needed me to." "You ain't pretty," Hannah said, but not cruelly, just the way children say truth when testing the edge of it. "No," Cora agreed, "I ain't." "But you're strong." Cora looked up at her then. "You think strong's enough." Hannah shrugged, then picked up the bucket and started back up the trail, strong and steady. That night Elias found a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on the table, its crust burnished golden, its scent warm as July. He stood there for a long time, staring. Then he touched the edge of it with 2 fingers, as though unsure it would hold. In the quiet corner room, Cora sat sewing a patch on one of Reuben's sleeves. The house, for the first time in years, felt full of breath, and that was only the beginning. The days lengthened. Wind softened its voice, and pale shoots pushed through the fields where Elias had turned the soil. It was a hard spring, not for lack of rain, but for how the past clung to everything. Like soot you couldn't scrub out, like a song half-remembered that still made you ache. Cora took to chores without asking, but never with the urgency of someone trying to prove worth. She just did what was needed. Picked nettles before the sun grew high, washed linens in creek water, mended fences when Elias was away too long and the mule broke loose. She spoke little, and when she did, it was only what the moment called for. Once, when Molly cut her palm on a shard of glass while poking in the shed, Cora didn't scold. She sat the child down on the porch steps, poured water over the wound, and bound it in clean cloth. "It'll scar," Molly whispered, voice gone small from fear. Cora tied the knot with gentle fingers. "It'll remind you to be more careful. That's all scars are for." The girl blinked up at her, quieted by the steadiness in that answer. At night, they sometimes gathered around the fire. Reuben began carving again, small animals from pine knots. The boy worked in silence, as if the shape was already inside the wood and he just needed to free it. Cora watched once, eyes narrowing the way one watches rain starting to form. "You carve like someone who listens," she told him. "That's a good way to be." He didn't answer, just turned the figure in his hand, but there was something settled in his shoulders after that. Elias stayed cautious. He spoke to her kindly, but with space. Often he would return late from the far field, hands blistered, back stiff, and find the children washed and the supper still warm. She never asked him where he'd been, never asked anything, really. But he noticed how she'd leave half an inch more stew in the pot, the way she moved his boots closer to the hearth so they'd dry faster overnight. He noticed how the house no longer echoed. One evening, after a long day hauling hay to dry on the higher slope, Elias caught her out back, hauling water in a yoke that pressed hard into her shoulders. Her face was drawn, sweat at her temples. He moved toward her before he could think to stop himself. "You shouldn't be lifting that much." She paused, water sloshing in the buckets. "You think I never carried before I came here." "I didn't mean." "You meant I should be softer," she said, not unkindly. "But softness didn't get me this far." She looked at him then, not defiant but steady. The kind of look that rooted into you, not demanding understanding, only stating what was. He held that look, then stepped forward and lifted the yoke off her shoulders. "Still," he said, "you don't need to do it alone." Cora didn't smile, but something eased in her jaw. She nodded once and let him carry the water. In late May, a letter came. It was addressed to Ruth Claymore in the round, tidy hand of a woman from back east. Elias read it on the porch, his brow tight. The children watched him from the window, Molly with her thumb at her lips. When he finished, he folded it slowly. "Old friend of Ma's," he said, answering their unspoken question. "Didn't know she passed, wanted to visit. She's sick now, says she won't travel." Cora looked at the letter, but didn't reach for it. Did Ruth write back to her? Not in years. They fell out over something I never learned. That night, Cora baked something sweet for the first time. A peach cobbler with jarred fruit found at the back of the cellar. They ate it in silence, the children smiling more with each bite. Elias looked at her and felt the letter's weight shift in his pocket, suddenly distant. Summer rose slowly, dragging heat behind it like a heavy cloak. The air smelled of sun-warmed wood and creaked. On Sundays, they didn't go to town. Elias said it was too far for tired feet, and Cora didn't ask again. Instead, she told the children stories while she shelled peas, stories that weren't fairy tales but half-true things about women who crossed mountains, who learned to live on kindness and bone-deep grit. "You make them up?" Reuben asked once. "No," she said, "I just remember different." And still, she hadn't shared her past, not really. They knew she came from Kansas, that her people were gone, that she hadn't been married. But the rest she kept folded inside like a letter you couldn't bear to send. Then came the fire. A lantern tipped in the shed. Reuben had been chasing a squirrel, and the flame caught fast on dry wood. Cora saw it first, came running with a bucket before Elias had even gotten up from the dinner table. Together they formed a line, children and all, passing water till the flames gave way. Her hair singed at the ends, skirt blackened with soot. She leaned into the smoke and cursed under her breath, not out of fear but fury that it might all be lost again. When it was over and the shed nothing but scorched ruin, she turned to the children. "You're not to light flame without knowing how wind moves," she said, voice low. "That's not just about danger, it's about respect." They nodded, solemn. And Elias, who had watched her throw herself into the blaze without pause, looked at her not like a stranger but something nearer kin. That night, when they sat in the quiet, Elias offered her the seat nearest the hearth. She took it without fuss. Reuben handed her a carved bird. She didn't speak, just held it in her palm a long time. Then Elias asked, "What did you lose?" She looked into the fire, and after a long silence said, "More than I kept. But not enough to stop me." The house held still, as if listening. And outside, the wind went gentle over the fields. By mid-June, the land was thick with promise. Wheat tall and green, birds nesting in the eaves, and the children barefoot near every hour they weren't needed indoors. The ache of winter was a long ways off, though none among them trusted it would stay that way forever. Cora began keeping a small garden near the porch, her own doing, unspoken. Not the wide rows Elias tended, but a square of soil for herbs and roots, mint, onion, chamomile, carrot. She planted it in silence and tended it with a knife on her belt and a piece of string at her wrist. The string was faded, dyed a blue knot found in the fields. No one asked about it. It was a dry stretch of days that brought the next change. Not in the sky, but in the people who came riding up the trail. 3 men, all strangers. 2 were from Fort Distrai, dust-choked and lean, their coats pinned open to show sidearms. The 3rd was older and rode a stallion too fine for this valley, his boots polished, his mustache trimmed to a thin, sharp line. They came mid-morning, when Elias was in the upper pasture and Cora was skimming milk in the shed. Reuben saw them first. He ran to the house, breath sharp, calling out before the first hoofbeat reached the door. The eldest of the men dismounted slow, surveying the place like he owned half the dirt in the world. "You the woman answers to Cora Linden," he called out. She came from the shed with her sleeves still rolled and her hands wet to the wrist. The children were near the door, Molly gripping the hem of Hannah's skirt. "I am," she said, calm. He nodded once. "Name, Winslow. I come from Grier County, looking for a runaway woman and a debt." "You match both." Elias had heard the voices on the wind and came riding fast from the rise. He dismounted before the horse stopped and stepped between Cora and the strangers without hesitation. "Whatever you're after," he said, low and steady, "this is my land." Winslow didn't blink. "Your land's holding something it shouldn't." Cora stepped beside Elias then, not behind. "You're wasting breath," she said to Winslow. "I paid my debt." In blood, sweat, and silence. "One man's payment ain't the law," Winslow said, "and you took something from my brother." Cora didn't flinch. "Your brother took more." The other 2 men shifted, hands near their belts. Elias kept still, jaw clenched. "You got papers?" he asked. "I got cause," Winslow answered. "That's not the same." The moment stretched, brittle as dry grass. Then Winslow gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're buying yourself trouble, farmer." Elias said nothing. But he didn't move. Winslow spit once into the dirt, then turned to his horse. "We'll be back with proof and law if need be." They rode off slow, making sure their dust stayed long behind them. Afterward, the silence was thick. Elias turned to Cora. "What was that?" She looked toward the edge of the field, past the place where shadow met light. "I lived in a house with a man who thought owning was loving. When I said no more, I didn't wait for permission to leave." Reuben's carved bird sat on the windowsill. Cora's hand found it. "You can send me away if you want," she said. "I didn't come here clean." Elias didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "You came honest. That's what counts." In the days that followed, watchfulness grew in them. Elias taught Reuben how to check the perimeter each morning. Cora took to keeping a hatchet beneath the porch. She told Hannah how to read hoofprints and how to boil willow bark for fever. "You always carry that string?" the girl asked once, nodding to the one on Cora's wrist. "It belonged to someone who taught me patience," Cora said. When no one came for a week, it was like a spell that stretched. Still, Elias kept a rifle near the hearth, and Cora checked every latch before dusk. One evening, rain came sudden and heavy. The creek swelled, the fields drank deep, and the children played in it like they'd never seen water before. Cora stood at the porch, arms crossed, watching their joy without interrupting. Elias came up beside her, hair damp from the barn. "Never seen them laugh like that," he said. "They need joy that doesn't depend on it lasting," she answered. He looked at her then, long and full. She met it without turning away. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I wasn't trying to be," she replied. That night, thunder rolled slow across the valley, and Cora dreamed of a woman with gray braids and hands like dry bark, whispering prayers in a language no longer spoken. When she woke, she lit a small candle and sat by the hearth until the first light came. Elias found her there, couldn't sleep. Dreams don't always leave easy. He poured coffee, sat without speaking. The fire cracked between them. And for the first time, their silence felt shared, not hollow but whole. The next day, Cora handed Hannah a book of pressed plants she had started. "It's yours now," she said. "Write what they do. And what you feel when you find them." Hannah looked down at the cover, worn leather and frayed stitching. She didn't smile, but her eyes shone with something too wide to name. Cora turned back to the stove. Her hands, as always, were steady. July came in hard, the kind of heat that drives snakes from shade and curls paint off old wood. The creek ran thinner. Cicadas rasped through the long hours, and still the valley held its breath. Elias took to early starts, working before the sun crowned the ridgeline. Reuben followed some mornings, his shoulders stronger now, his eyes sharp from watching the land the way Cora taught him. Hannah kept her plant book close, dog-eared and smudged, and Molly spoke more often in whispers than in cries. Cora had begun to change too, though not in any way loud. She moved slower now, not from weakness but deliberation. As if every step was part of a vow she'd made to the earth, to remain, to tend, to mend what others abandoned. It was the Sunday after the second full moon when Winslow returned. No men flanking him this time. Just him on the same bay stallion, wearing a vest lined with papers. He dismounted with a kind of smug patience, hat held loose in his hand. "Got the law," he said before he was even at the gate. "Signed and sealed by a judge back east. She owes, and I've come to collect." Elias stood in the yard, rake in hand. He didn't move. Cora stepped out from the barn's shade, hands empty but calm. "Let me see it," she said. Winslow held out the parchment, his smirk sharp as a blade. She took it, read it without flinching. "You lied," she said finally. "This writ's for a different name." "Alias or not, it's you," he said. "Cora Linden. Formerly Clara Milbourne." Elias looked at her, then at Winslow. "She told me her name," he said, "but not the rest. She stole from my brother, jewelry, a horse, dignity." Cora folded the paper, set it on the fence post. "He lost the right to claim dignity the night he locked me in a root cellar, because I said I wouldn't lie with him." Winslow's mouth thinned. "You've got no proof." "I've got scars," she said. "I've got breath. That's more than I had then." Elias stepped forward, rake still at his side. "You aiming to take her back by force?" Winslow shifted. "I've got legal ground." "Maybe out east you do. But this land don't run on parchment." They stood like that, three adults in the hot sky and the watching hush of children pressed behind curtains. Finally, Winslow stepped back. "You'll see this again in court. I'll find a sheriff who gives a damn." "You find one who believes your brother's reputation won't rot your case," Cora said, "and I'll be there to answer." He mounted slow, glared once more, then turned his horse and kicked up dust. Cora didn't speak as she walked inside. But that night, she sat down beside the hearth and opened the old ledger Ruth used to keep, record of hens and eggs, debts paid in bushels, cloth traded for milk. She began a new page. In careful, square letters, she wrote, "July, Cora Linden, not owed, not owned, present." Then she closed the book and set it on the shelf. The children didn't ask what it meant. But Hannah copied the words onto the back of a pressed yarrow, and Reuben carved a likeness of a key into soft pine and left it beside her basin. The house felt lighter after that. Like something had broken open, not to fall apart but to breathe. A week later, a stranger came walking the trail. Not a man this time, but a woman with skin like river clay and braids down her back, walking with a limp and a worn pack over her shoulder. She introduced herself as Alma. "Looking for Cora Linden," she said. Cora stepped forward, surprised. "You knew my mother," Alma said. Cora blinked. "Your mother was Seraphine." Alma nodded. Cora's knees nearly gave. Then she embraced the woman with a tenderness she hadn't shown anyone yet, not from fear, but from the pain of memory finding you alive again. Alma stayed 3 nights, sleeping in the barn loft by choice. She brought herbs and stories and news of a circle of women out west who helped those fleeing violence find new names, new homes, sometimes even new kin. Cora asked no questions, but Elias saw the way her hand stayed close to Alma's when they sat under the cottonwood. Before Alma left, she pressed something into Cora's hand. This was hers. She said to give it to the one who walks quiet but plants deep. It was a stone pendant, etched with a spiral. She said you'd know what it meant. Cora held it in her palm for a long while, then she strung it beside the blue cord at her wrist. Alma looked to Elias. "You've got a good one here." He only nodded, not out of doubt but reverence. That night after the house had quieted and the sky cracked open with stars, Elias stood on the porch and found her beside him. "I didn't know your past," he said. "I didn't come here to be it," she replied. He nodded. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You've put down more roots than I ever managed." And she, not looking at him, just said, "Some things only grow when they're safe." Inside, Molly turned in her sleep. A moth tapped against the glass. And Cora, for the first time since arriving, leaned against Elias without thinking. Her weight was small, but it steadied him more than all the years behind him. August pressed hard on the valley like a hand against the chest, tight, dry, unrelenting. The grasses browned early, and every breeze carried a whisper of dust. Still, they rose each morning with purpose. Routine had become something more than necessity. It had become kinship. Cora's garden began to bolt in the heat, sending up flower and seed. She let it, collecting the pods and teaching Hannah how to dry them proper. "Next spring," she said, laying each small envelope in a tin box, "you'll plant not from memory, but from what endured." Elias, too, was changing. Not in ways that drew notice all at once, but in smaller things. His gait less hurried, the angle of his shoulders eased, the way he left the door open longer after coming in, as if some part of him had stopped fearing what absence might follow. One late afternoon, while they were shelling beans at the table, Reuben looked up suddenly. "You gonna stay, Cora?" The question hung, fragile and bare. She set a bean pod down, met his eyes. "You want me to?" He didn't answer. But he didn't look away either. Then Molly, quiet as a feather drifting down, said, "If you go, who'll sing us the quiet songs?" Cora didn't sing, not in the usual way. But she had a habit of humming low when rocking the chair near the fire, a kind of sound that didn't need words to comfort. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and though her voice didn't rise, something in the room settled. That night Elias carved her name into the side of the pantry door. Not large, not showy. Just one more name among the others, Ruth, Elias, Reuben, Hannah, Molly, Cora, as if she'd always belonged. Trouble, though, is never so far behind that a body can stop looking over their shoulder. It was the first chill night of August when word came by way of Jeb Tucker, the cowhand who rode fence on the North Range. He came to barter eggs for tobacco and left with a warning. "Man with a badge asking after a woman used to be Clara Milbourne," he said, eyes cautious. Said he was from Grier. Looking to bring her back east for questioning. Elias took this in like stone sinking slow into a well. Cora didn't flinch. "I won't run," she said. "Didn't think you would." They stayed up late that night, oil lamp throwing long shadows, the ledger book open on the table. Cora had added more pages, lists of plants she'd dried, salves she'd made, books she'd mended, stories she'd written down from Molly's half-sleep mumblings. "I want them to remember," she said, "not just me. But the way we made room." Elias looked down at the list and saw, among the tidy lines, one that read, "August, day unknown." Elias smiled in his sleep. He said nothing of it. Just kept his hand near hers on the table until both their fingers rested like roots entwined. 3 days later, the sheriff arrived. He was younger than Winslow, with clear eyes and a badge that looked too clean for travel. He came on horseback alone, but the weight of the law clung to him like smoke. "You Cora Linden?" he asked when she stepped out to meet him. She nodded. Elias and the children stayed just behind her. "I've got a request for questioning signed by a judge in Grier County." She held out her hand. He gave it over. She read it, folded it. "I'll go," she said, "if I ride with my own." The sheriff seemed surprised. "You understand, this could turn into a trial." "I understand," she said, "but I don't think you do," he added, gentler than before. "Out there, the story they tell has more ink than truth." Cora's eyes were steady. "Then I'll bring truth in my own hands." Elias stepped forward. "She doesn't ride alone," he said. The sheriff looked at him, then at the children, who clung now to Cora's skirts with small hands and dry throats. "3 days' ride," the sheriff said. "We leave at dawn." That night, Cora packed only what she'd brought with her and the tin of seeds Hannah had helped her label. She left the pendant with the spiral with Molly. "For safekeeping," she said. "You coming back?" Molly asked. "I always come back to what's mine," Cora answered. Elias saddled the mule and packed light. Before they left, he stood a moment beside the pantry door, running his fingers over the carved names. Outside, the stars watched without judgment. And as dawn stretched gold across the brittle valley, Cora mounted without pause, Elias beside her. They rode out not like prisoners or runaways, but like a woman and a man carrying a truth that had no intention of dying quiet. They rode west with the sun behind them, down roads where dust gathered in the folds of clothing and silence bloomed between hoofbeats. The sheriff was fair, kept distance, didn't press. Cora rode like a woman who knew how to endure distance, Elias like a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything to stand for. On the second night, they camped near a dry creek where cottonwoods leaned like old sentries. Cora built a fire with practiced hands, and Elias sat beside her, sharpening a blade with slow rhythm. "You afraid?" he asked her, not looking up. "No," she said after a moment. "Fear, only loud when you're still hoping to go unnoticed." "I've been seen." They slept near the coals, back to back, like two halves of something no longer broken. The town of Grier rose out of the land without grace, flat buildings, paint peeling, eyes watching from windows as they passed. The sheriff led them to the courthouse, where a clerk with a bored face took their names and their papers. "Judge's out till morning," he said, waving vaguely. "You can stay at the livery or find your own arrangements." "We don't cover it." They took a room above the Smiths, whose wife offered stale bread and clean blankets. Cora sat by the window, watching the narrow street below. "That man who called you a thief," Elias said from the corner. "You never told me what you took." Cora smiled, not with her mouth but her eyes. "My name," she said, "and my right to carry it into the next chapter." Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Seems to me," he said, "he's the one did the stealing." In the morning, the judge was an old woman with eyes like slate, and a cane she used more like punctuation than support. She read the petition, looked at Cora, then at the man Winslow had finally brought, the brother. He was heavy-set now, softer than the threat Cora remembered, with fingers that trembled at the hem of his coat. The judge listened to them both. To Winslow's brother, who spun tales of betrayal and reputation and gold bracelets gone missing. And then to Cora, who stood with her hands at her sides, voice calm, recounting the night she ran, the cellar door, the bruises. The firelight that made her shadow look twice its size as she stepped into the dark. Elias did not speak. He only stood behind her. When Cora finished, the judge closed her ledger and leaned forward. "Do you have anything left to claim?" she asked the brother. He hesitated. Then, with a sneer, "Only what's owed me." The judge tapped her cane once. "I find no ownership here," she said. "No theft, no contract binding. This woman owes no man her presence." The gavel fell like the last stone of winter slipping from a roof. Outside, the street smelled of horses and heat. Cora stood still a long moment, then turned to Elias. "I thought it would feel different," she said. He waited. "But maybe freedom's not the rush. Maybe it's just the steadiness that follows." They rode home slower, stopping when they pleased. Once to rest near a grove of juniper, where the wind brought the scent of resin and warm dirt. Another time to help a farmer lift a wagon wheel from a rut. Cora didn't ask names, just offered her hands and kept moving. On the fifth evening, they came over the ridge and saw the valley open like a breath held too long. The roof of the house winked with late light. The children ran to meet them, Molly first, then Reuben with his slingshot still tucked in his belt, then Hannah taller now, or maybe just older from the waiting. Inside, nothing had changed but the air. It was full. That night they ate cornbread and beans with wild plum jam Cora had put up before they left. She lit a candle and set it in the window. "For Alma," she said, "in case her path brings her near again." Later, while the children slept, Elias stood beside her at the porch rail. The moon was high, the wind soft. "You never asked if I meant to marry you," she said. "I didn't reckon you owed me that." "But what if I asked you instead?" she said. "Not for ownership, just to be chosen again and again." He looked at her, her hands calloused, her voice steady, her name whole. "I'd say yes," he said, "so long as you never stop choosing." And so it was, not with fanfare, not with rings, but with the scent of late grass and the hush of trust grown slow. The valley bore witness. The house held their names. And when the wind came again, it carried no sorrow, only the sound of something rooted, something mended, something that had found its shape at last.